Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. Urban explorers, what's the creepiest or scariest thing you've come across? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I helped a friend who worked in council housing with documenting flats that were empty. We found some illegal tenants, a mark on the floor left by one who died, and something that I still think about years afterwards. A small flat that looked like someone just went to buy groceries and disappeared, with dinner on a stove, completely rotten by then, and all the flat surfaces covered with sheets of paper filled with a Powerball lottery number prediction system written down by hand. Thousands and thousands of combinations. Above an old clothing store in my hometown, I and some friends discovered an old abandoned apartment. It was still decorated like it was 1965. After letting ourselves in, we discovered a mannequin covered in human shit. It was obvious that someone had taken a huge dump in the toilet, made a huge shitty mess, and covered the mannequin with it. Ran into some methed out scrappers in an abandoned school at night. I was with a group of like 8, and we had split into 2 groups. We saw headlamps and yelled over to them, thinking it was the other group. They just turned off their headlamps and started walking toward us. When they saw how many of us there were, they just yelled some shit and left for another part of the building. The old abandoned factory building had a big concrete room that was drawn all over with really freaky demonic runes from floor to ceiling with red paint. In hindsight, maybe drawn by someone with schizophrenia based on the intricacy and chaotic design. They had a lot of time to cover this room. Terrifying to stumble onto with only a tiny flashlight at night. I was more freaked out that someone might have been in there with me, that I just couldn't see in the dark. More of a primal fear of another person than anything supernatural. Very spooky vibes. Place is now a condo and supermarket. I was in an abandoned factory 20 years ago. Paper mill? It was huge. Had its own train station, laboratory, random machines, and its own streets with intersections. It was like out of a zombie movie. The weird part was that it just seemed as if everyone vanished. We noticed that after an hour or so of exploring, the locker rooms had clothing as if you just took it off. Boots still there side by side. You can see the positions of where people were. The lab still has beakers and stuff still full. Some evaporated. Offices had files, desks, and pens. The fridge had milk that expired in 1991 with other food. This freaked us out because we thought maybe we were exposed to some sort of chemical contamination. I never found any information on this place online. Zero. Not a trace of this place. It's now completely gone. Out walking my dog one day, I went off the beaten path a bit and found a small pond near a highway bridge. My dog was swimming in the water, and I was standing beside the pond watching him. I glanced down at the brush around my feet and noticed a pen on the ground, then another, and another. I realized that they were actually all needles, and there were hundreds of them. The brush on the ground was thick enough that I hadn't noticed them when I first walked in. I picked up my dog and carried him out quickly. I still have nightmares about it and can't drive by the bridge without feeling sick to my stomach. Exploring a large mental hospital long-term care facility for those with severe mental handicaps several years ago, I made my way into the basement, which consisted of one long, wide corridor running from one end of the main building to the other, with rooms branching off of either side. Some rooms had high windows in them, and the stairwells at either end had windows as well. So both ends of the corridor were relatively illuminated, with a short, very dark stretch in the middle. I walked from one end to the other, poking around in various rooms as I went. Once I hit the dark portion, I stepped into one room, which was pitch black, and snapped on my flashlight. Directly across from me was a wall of body storage freezers. The one room in the place with zero illumination, which I was now standing in, was the morgue. I was exploring an abandoned hotel, and as I went to one of the rooms, my whole body froze, and I had instant goosebumps because there was a blood splatter with chunks of what looked like flesh mixed in on the wall, and a body sitting on a chair next to it with a bullet hole going through the side of the head. But the feeling didn't last long, because I realized it was a life-sized stuffed doll and paint someone had set up. Still felt my soul leave my body for a second. LOL. Homeless encampment that was easy to spot by Google Maps next to a huge steel factory with multiple buildings spanning 2 blocks. It was completely devoid of homeless people, even on a cold night. One was even telling us not to go in there. I have no clue why they were all staying out of it. Maybe it was the smell of sulfur or the random noises, with the complete lack of lights in many spots. Story from a friend from Austria. Near his town, there was an old factory. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew this building, and even private rave parties were organized there. There was only one area in the basement that nobody entered because the door was locked. The door was welded from the inside and outside. After a long time, they succeeded in breaking out the door, and they found a clean surgery room with human-sized cages. They called the police, and shortly afterwards, the room was destroyed. Yeah, that was probably a dead body. I don't know what else it could have been, unless there was a bunch of dead raccoons or squirrels somewhere, but if you bang on the door and there's no movement, people are usually on alert in areas like that. Glad you didn't go in there. Chernobyl exclusion zone before the invasion. It was spring, fresh green growth everywhere, flowers, fresh scents, an area with the full beauty of nature on display. All my senses telling my lizard brain that everything here is right and good, while the dicks of Geiger counter were telling my frontal lobe that this was badly wrong place. Get out. My every sense was working perfectly and happily heading me astray. It was very weird and unsettling feeling of dissonance and blindness and vulnerability. Went to explore this abandoned college campus with my girlfriend. The football stadium was really cool, but then she asked if we could try to get into the dorms. So we find a break in the chain link fence surrounding it and crawl through. We hop up through a broken window into the building. It's dark, damp, and smells gross, but we start walking around, and it's pretty cool. Just kind of looks exactly how you'd expect an abandoned college dorm to look. Trashed. I get to the fire stairs, and lo and behold, the door is open. We go upstairs, and the hallway is just piled with trash. It was not like the downstairs, and it smelled like actual death. My girlfriend got scared and wanted to leave because of how bad the smell was. I told her to stay there and crept down the hallway. The first door on my right was cracked open, and the smell was clearly emanating from this room. I could hardly breathe. It peered into it and saw the end of a sleeping bag on the floor with what looked like feet inside. I slowly pushed the door open and almost shit myself. There was a guy in a sleeping bag. He was old and obviously homeless. I banged my fist against the door to see if he would react. No movement. Again, but harder. Nothing. I quickly turned and told my girlfriend that we were leaving. Although I'm not 100% certain that he was dead, it definitely smelled like it. Friend and I were with a couple of girls back in the day in our late teens. We were driving around in bump bored and decided to drive to a nearby mountain and see the sights, hoping to get some action after a joint or two. We come upon this old dirt road that came out into a large open area going up the side of a mountain. There was a random gate with a simple latch. From there, you could see an old train depot about halfway up the open area. The area was in the middle of absolutely nowhere and had a lot of history in logging, which the train would have been primarily used to transport lumber and workers. Depot may not have been the right word, as no trains were parked there, but it was a decent-sized building with a small booth out from the still had the rusted levers and mechanisms to switch tracks. So the girls start saying that we should go in and explore the main building, obviously teasing us to see if we'd chicken out, as it honestly looked pretty dilapidated and ominous. But in the spirit of teenage hormones and insecurity, we opened the gate and drove onward. After exploring the booth and the perimeter, we went in. At first it was completely empty, nothing too crazy, but it was definitely eerie. I'm desperately trying to ignore the weed stoking my paranoia of suddenly running into another person way out here. Half for my own sanity, and half because of the girl practically on my hip, who I could tell was visibly uncomfortable, but trying to play it off. Her friend was laughing and doing the whole boo shit out of the rooms to the rest of us. We get to an area that was once probably a kitchen, and see a door that we can only surmise is some kind of basement. We open it slowly. We never made it down. Up to pretty much the first 3 steps is just still water from years of mountain snowmelt. Maybe there was a busted pipe that had run long enough before being shut off. However, many decades ago. I have no effing clue. All I knew is that the water looked repulsive and smelled worse. The floorboards, feeling somewhat soft, suddenly made a lot of sense than just my age. I'm immediately envisioning us falling through the floor of this shithole and getting dunked into a soup of a century in the making. But in the hubris of youth, we keep going upstairs. It was just a long hallway with a window on the end and 2 doors on each side. The light from the window made the doorways seem like black holes, but that may have been the fact that my entire mind is just begging to get this over with and get the f*** out of here. But we hadn't found anywhere near the worst of it. The first 3 rooms are nothing but cobwebs and dust, but the 4th. 2 dirty mattresses that weren't new, but too new for this place, side by side. Dark stains on them, no sheets. 2 backpacks, one that was just emptied of junk all over the floor. But on the mattress and off to the side were multiple pairs of women's panties with blood on them. What got me is there were different sizes. There was fresh food wrappers too. My gut sank, and I genuinely began trembling. The other backpack had a more masculine look to it and had some clothes visible in the main compartment. My senses immediately flooded with dread, and the feeling of something really bad happened here, get the count now, was overwhelming. I looked at the girl I was with, and she was silently crying beside me, death gripping my sleeve. My friend and his girl were dead silent and wide-eyed beside us. They'd been goofing off the entire time. You could hear a pin drop. We all wordlessly were listening to see if whoever was responsible was moving in the building. What felt like an eternity passed until I finally snapped out of the panic. The sun was setting. We gotta move. King, hoof it. Don't run downstairs, we'll probably go through. I don't think I'd seen him drive faster, which is saying something. He didn't touch the brake until we were miles away and back into a town. Nobody spoke for a good couple of hours. We went about the night, paired off to our own places. Outside of one conversation I had with Dee about it years later, none of us spoke of it again. I enjoy going out looking for wildlife to photograph in the summer, specifically reptiles and insects, which sometimes leads me off the beaten path. One time I was at a provincial park not far from my town and wandered pretty far into the meadow and woods and ended up coming upon someone's property adjacent to the park. There was a small wooden shed with windows on each side. It looked abandoned. It was dark and looked old and weathered, so I wandered over to see if there were any interesting critters. When I got close, I could see the outside of the shed and windows were covered in cobwebs and dirt and debris. But then I noticed movement through the window. I figured it was a wild animal and went over, brushed away the webs, branches, and dirt, and cupped my hands to the glass. I saw chinchillas, lots of chinchillas, in small wire cages. One right up against the window with 2 of them moving back and forth. It was startling. I realized it was not abandoned, but someone's little chinchilla collection. There were a lot, though. I peeked again, and there was no light or anything in the shed. Just a few shelves with maybe 10 small cages holding 2 to 3 chinchillas each. I'm guessing it was for fur. At that point, I heard dogs barking and approaching and decided to make a retreat. It was so weird. I didn't report it, I'm sorry to say, because I was kind of not where I was supposed to be anyway, and didn't really know how to get back there afterwards. Maybe it was a happy chinchilla rescue? I don't know. Not urban, but a disturbing scene nonetheless. My then girlfriend and I were hiking through the Garden of the Gods in Colorado, nice, in the early 1990s, and came upon a really grisly scene. Someone had cut up a few German Shepherd dogs and burned parts of them in what appeared to be a ritual. They'd also graffitied some of the surrounding tall, thin stones with demonic-looking symbols. Blood was all over, which made me believe the dogs had been killed there and dismembered. Another couple wandered in, and the four of us decided that they would go to the nearest ranger station while we stayed on the scene since we had stumbled upon it first. Rangers showed up, and when they seemed to be nonplussed about it, I asked if this was something they'd seen before. They said it happened often enough because the Garden of the Gods was considered a thin place, which some pagan religions deemed sacred. They said they'd seen this before, but they thanked us for pointing it out because people still hiked through there, and it would need to be cleaned up. When I asked if there was any significance that the dogs all looked to be German Shepherds, a ranger said that it was a power thing. German Shepherds were thought to be powerful dogs, and sacrificing a powerful animal supposedly gave you more power and authority. Lots of scary folks out there. Not horrible, but odd. When I was younger, I lived on a large property of land with my family. There were other properties around, and we were all separated by woods for the most part. One day my dog was lost, so my dad and I headed out around the area to find him. Eventually we came upon a foundation of a home in a very overgrown area with clear burn marks or damage where the frame met this concrete foundation. The only structure intact was a small woodshed. It was filled with stacks of phone books. Pallets were shoved into little sheds for some reason, alongside some children's toys and a little trike. In speaking to the neighbors about it, all they said was that it used to be a meth lab in the house, the foundation we found, that completely blew up and burned down, like a seriously large explosion. It was so odd. Second to my dad finding a U.S. Postal Service mail truck from likely before the 50s inside the forest that was between our property and our neighbors. It would have been impossible to get the truck out there unless the truck preceded the forest. Overall, super odd stuff, lol. And we did find the dog. I and two buddies were exploring an abandoned hotel a couple of months ago. We got in through a broken window on the first floor. I'll skip the boring stuff, but after exploring most of the hotel, we started being pretty loud. I know this was stupid of us. We were walking down this hallway with rooms on either side. The hallway still had light, but the rooms did not. I was in front of the group, leading with a flashlight. I got a little ahead of my other buddies because they were goofing off and laughing behind me. As I entered one of the dark rooms, I shined my flashlight in one of the bathrooms. Kneeling down in the corner was a man. I kind of just stared at him in disbelief for 2 or 3 seconds before he yelled, "What are you doing?" and got up and started to chase us. While I and my buddies were running for our lives, one of my friends tripped and fell at the end of the hallway while he was chasing us. We helped him up quickly and practically dove head first out the window we crawled through. Once we had gotten a safe distance away, we all kind of just started to laugh at the situation. That was the only time we had ever come across an aggressive person while urban exploring. A few years ago, I explored an old Catholic boys' school in my area. Interestingly, a movie had been filmed there in the early 2000s. One night, a group of us decided to check it out. We split up to cover more ground. I didn't want to go through a hole in the door to a chapel. My brother decided to use a half-broken staircase to go to the upper floors. I wasn't small enough or light enough to do either, and I found myself heading into the basement. The tunnels down there were claustrophobic and dimly lit, but curiosity kept me moving. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small, out-of-place room. It was painted a sickly pink, with a single wooden chair sitting dead center. The atmosphere in that room was suffocating, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I bolted, not daring to look back, and vowed never to step in that place again. To this day, I walk past that building a few times a week, but I never look directly at it. I can't shake the feeling that it's watching me. Years later, I heard a group of ghost hunters visited the site. They apparently experienced some bizarre, unexplainable shit. And as if that wasn't enough, it turns out that the place is riddled with asbestos, making it a hazard even without the ghosts.